Now for these little bolts that I have here, I'm going to go ahead and remove all of them except for one of them. If I just go ahead and delete these out, I want to show you another quick trick for using instances. Now with one single sphere selected here, one thing that I can do is I can go ahead and very, very quickly, I'm going to go ahead and hide everything except for these two bits here. And so what I'm going to do next is I want to go ahead and I want this sphere to go ahead and duplicate, 4 times around the shape of this top silhouette. So to do that, I can quickly go into the top view, and if you've been working along on a grid, which is basically at the very, very center of 0, 0, 0. And if I go into a top view, you can see that this particular shape is perfectly aligned on the grid. There's a quick trick that you can use under the hierarchy tab. You can go ahead and set this to use working pivot. And the working pivot is going to automatically be set to 0, 0, 0 in the world. And so, for example, if I go out to the perspective view, you can see that it's telling me that the working pivot is down here. And so by looking at this from a top view, I can go ahead and switch to the rotation mode, and then go ahead and hold down the shift key using the rotation, and I can go ahead and instance this across 3 times. And that's using the working pivot, and that's over here again under the hierarchy tab under use working pivot. Now when you're done using the working pivot, you want to go ahead and click that back off to go ahead and go back into your editing process. Now if done correctly, that's going to go ahead and align each of those little nubs around the cylindrical shape of this top cap that we have. Now while we're in the area, I think that it's important that you understand a little bit about the differences between using an instance and a copy. Now if I go ahead and hold down the shift key and just move this object off to the side, I'm going to have the option of making this a copy or an instance or a reference. Now references we won't really get into too much, but the majority of the time you'll probably be wanting to use either a copy or an instance. So let's clarify exactly what the differences are between these two. So if I go ahead and press OK as a copy, that's going to go ahead and make a duplicate of the object out here in world space. And as you'll notice that the object description over here isn't in bold letters, whereas this one over here is. That's an indication of the fact that this object is an instance of another one, whereas this object is a copy, is not bolded. Now what exactly a copy means is that if I go ahead and grab the vertices of the shape and move them around or do some sort of adjustments to them, nothing is going to happen to the original versions of them. Just like if you made a copy at a copy machine and you take it home and you write all over it, it's not going to do anything or change the original version of that copy. That's exactly how copies work inside of 3ds Max as well. Now with that in mind, if I go ahead and delete this copy and hold down the shift key again, and this time instead I'm going to go ahead and set this to an instance. If I go ahead and press OK, and then I go back into vertice mode and then go ahead and just move them or mess them up in any way, shape, or form, you'll notice that all of the original instances of this shape are also getting messed up as well. And that's basically how the process works as far as instances go, that any sort of adjustments or changes that you make to one version or any version of that instance, all of those other instances are going to be affected as well. Now in this demonstration today, we're going to be using a lot of instances, and that's going to be very, very helpful because instead of having to model multiple copies of each of these pieces over and over again, we can go ahead and make one and then go ahead and use instances. Now there's another specific point I'd like to call out when working with a shape like this, and this is a very simple editable poly which started from a spherical shape, and I created it in such a way that I intentionally am not going to go ahead and use Turbo Smooth for it. When working with high poly, sometimes there are issues that you'll have with certain primitives and certain shapes, such as a sphere, when you utilize the Turbo Smooth modifier. So if I go ahead and bring up just this shape itself, and I go ahead and put a Turbo Smooth modifier on it, and I turn up these iterations. Now at first glance you might not see much of an issue with it, but if I go ahead and really zoom way in on this sphere, you'll notice that you get a lot of this bunching up and this sort of a starfish pattern or something right here in the middle of that object anytime you try to do a Turbo Smooth. So if I go ahead and look at the wireframe of it, you can kind of see what's happening with it. And using a spherical shape like this, it tends to get a little bit nasty right around in here where this polar point is happening, where all these triangles are kind of coming to this single point. You'll notice, like I said, this in here, this is basically what's happening. And so with the edge control turned off, you can see this sort of a pattern. And so in order to create this shape without having to use a turbo smooth, there's a very simple trick that you can utilize just by simply creating a sphere itself and giving it enough iterations. So I'll go ahead and show you exactly what I mean by that. I'm going to go ahead and switch this to a front view, and then I'm just going to go ahead and create a sphere, and I'm just going to go ahead and bring it into the viewport just about the same size as my existing one, just to give you a quick idea of how to create this shape. And by default, you may be set to something like about 16 segments or something relatively low. And so when working with a spherical shape like this, by default, I'll go ahead and start with at least 32, maybe 64, even go all the way up to 100. It doesn't really matter when we're working with a high poly. I mean, as many triangles as you can kind of throw at it without destroying your processing on your computer. That's kind of what your goal is. So if I go ahead and set that to about 100, that's going to give me a really, really smooth spherical shape. And I can go ahead and just convert this to an editable poly, go into the top view, and then all I will do is just go ahead and delete out some of the back faces of it, and then take a look at it next to our shape here. And then all I may need to do is just go ahead and just sort of scale this in just slightly to kind of conform to the shape. So that's basically how creating a piece of geometry with a rounded off cap like that can work without having to worry about the pinching process utilizing Turbo Smooth. So I'm going to go ahead and reuse this little spherical bolt here and apply it to the four corners of this little plating that we have as well. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the top of the bolt, go ahead and hold down shift and drag this down, and we're going to go ahead and make another instance of it. I'm going to grab both of these two pieces and isolate the selection. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into a top view, and I'm just going to kind of eyeball where I want this to go in the corner on the top left hand corner on this actual plate. So if I go into perspective, you can kind of see what I'm talking about. I know that I'm going to kind of want this to line up on all four corners right about there in that position for now. I'll just start by just kind of eyeballing it in, and that's looking pretty good. So the next thing I'll do is I'll go ahead and switch to a front view. I'll go ahead and grab that one sphere and switch to the hierarchy tab, and under a Fit Pivot Only, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and click on Reset Pivot. Sometimes your pivot points may be out in no man's land in 3D space, and so the first thing that you're going to want to always do when you're doing an alignment adjustment like this is go ahead and reset it. And so the next thing I'll do is I'll go ahead and use the Align tool, and I'll align the pivot point to the actual plating itself. And I'll make sure that I'm set to the center along the X, Y, and the Z, and that's going to go ahead and put the pivot point right in the dead center of that plating, and go ahead and click Apply and then OK. And so from here, all I need to do is utilize the mirror tool. If I go ahead and click on that, I can easily mirror an instance of this bolt shape along the y-axis. Go ahead and press OK. And then if I hold down Control and grab another version of them, I can go ahead and mirror it once again along the X coordinate. And that's going to go ahead and make sure that I have all four of them perfectly aligned in the same position at all four corners of the plate. So if I go ahead and zoom this out, you can see how that lines up.